Hi, it's Stef. I'm back for seconds and I'm so glad you are too. Today's From Scratchee Delight will be handmade noodles. I wanted this to be my first tutorial because noodles have been my signature dish for the past few years and it's not hard to understand why. Number one, I love pasta. I feel like if you have a favorite food that you're not making from scratch, now's the time to start, because the first time that I made handmade noodles, the level up from like Buitoni refrigerated noodles was remarkable and it was amazing. I haven't looked back. Number two, pasta is one of those really impressive crowd pleasers. For some reason, I'm always amazed by the reaction of friends and family when I make handmade noodles for like a dinner gathering, that they are so impressed because they appear a lot more difficult than they are. Let's be clear, noodle making, handmade noodles, they can be time consuming, especially depending on the equipment that you have. However, they are not difficult. That leads into number three. There is a real artistry to making pasta that is really, really satisfying. When you make pasta, it's not a straightforward recipe where you have this many eggs, measure this much flour, oil, salt. It's not like that. You do a lot of feeling. You become one with the dough. And that's one thing I love about this recipe, is that satisfaction when somebody says, "Oh my gosh, you have to give me the recipe." And I'm like, "I'm really sorry, I don't have one. I just really feel it out." And I feel like such a turd when I say that. It is true, but there's like an artisanal quality to making pasta that's really, really satisfying and very humble braggy, which I think is a bonus. So today we're gonna check it out. Come along with me. So I've gotten out all the ingredients that we'll need to make pasta. The first ingredient is eggs. You'll need some all-purpose flour, and I also recommend having some semolina flour. Now, all-purpose is non-negotiable. You have to have flour to make pasta. However, if you make it just with all-purpose flour, you'll wind up with a noodle that is much more delicate in both flavor and texture. Adding semolina gives it some of that al dente quality that you really can't achieve otherwise with a handmade noodle. The reason is because store-bought noodles, like the box kind, are made typically with wheat and water, not with eggs and flour. Also, it's a different process. They're pressed through a mold versus being rolled out by hand like these. So semolina returns some of that al dente quality and it makes the noodle just a little bit chewier. Next, you'll need some oil, olive oil preferably. It's Italia. Also some salt. That's all we need for ingredients. Oh, don't forget a big bowl so you can mix it all up. That's all we need for ingredients, so we'll get started making it. What I've done is crack eggs into the bowl. When you watch traditional Italian pasta making, I think typically you see like a mound of flour and then the person cracks the eggs into a little well that's on top and then they mix it up with their hands. The reason I prefer not to do that is because, one, I'm not that precise. I don't know that I can eyeball how much flour I'm going to need, and I hate wasting flour. So I start with the eggs. Now, the general rule is that one egg will yield about a serving of pasta, and it's a pretty generous serving. So I typically crack as many eggs as I want to use. Here I'm doing just 2. Give them a little swirl, and then next I'll add the salt. I use about a palmful of salt per egg, just like a little round. I would guess that that's about a half a teaspoon. But a little mound of salt per egg. Now, if you are not into salty food, I would recommend maybe using a bit less and then working your way up, because you can always salt the pasta after. This is the intrinsic salt that's part of the recipe, and I would hate for you to not have as salty a palate as I do and add more than you actually want. Next, I do about a tablespoon of oil per egg. We'll give that a little mix again. Now here's a good spot where you could add some dry Italian herbs if you wanted to. Sometimes when I make pasta, I'll add some dried basil or oregano, or if you even wanted to add some fresh garlic, you could do it now, and then you'll know that it gets evenly distributed throughout the dough. Next we have flour. Now I prefer to do about a 2/3 all-purpose to a 1/3 semolina. And let me rephrase that, about 2/3 all-purpose and a 1/3 whatever else you want to throw in there. The other night I made some noodles that had semolina and also whole wheat. I felt like that would be a little healthier because I was really just making them for my son, and the taste was pretty good. I think, in my opinion, the 2/3, 1/3 helps keep the integrity of the taste and texture of the noodles, and you can still sneak in some whole wheat and not have it be too grainy. I think grainy is a good way to describe the way I feel about store-bought whole wheat noodles. They're just kind of icky to me. So once you get a little bit of a good mix, then you can really get in there with your hands. One thing that's really common with pasta making is you'll see people adding water. Now would not be the time to add water at all. If you have to add water, that's a sign, I mean this in the nicest way possible, that something has gone awry. There's nothing wrong with adding water. Sometimes you have to be able to roll out the dough if it's too dry. But if you do have to add water, now is not the time to do it, because we're gonna let this dough rest. And during that rest period, the dough is gonna kind of soak up all of the moisture from those eggs. So as it sits there, it'll get a little more moist over time. Now you work it into just kind of a rough ball, like this little guy. And you don't have to work on it too much. I like to make sure that it feels about as squishy as Play-Doh. I have used Play-Doh recently, I'm sorry to say. So once it gets that little Play-Doh-like consistency, if it's super dry, you'll see flour like dropping off, and you can see I haven't even quite used all of the flour in my bowl. That was a 1/2 cup, measuring cup that I used. But I'll take a few of the little chunkier pieces, work them back in a little bit. If your dough is too dry, it's going to be really tough to roll it out. If it's too wet, it's going to be sticking to your machine, and you'll have to add flour. Adding flour is another thing, another sign that maybe something has gone awry. So you can see the color. It's about the same color as the semolina. So what I'll do is grab some saran wrap. I'm going to wrap this up and let it sit for about 20 minutes. Okay, so now that your dough is all nice and rested, you're ready to get started with the fun part. It'll be fun for the first few times, then it's not going to be fun, it's just going to be work. But all you have to do is tear off a piece of your dough. I like to make it like the size of maybe a couple of eggs, not too huge, the size of your palm about. And then you'll turn on your little turner. And you want to keep it on the lowest setting. Sometimes it's 0, sometimes it's 1, but on the largest pasta setting that's possible. And this will help work the dough into its more uniform shape as well. So you just run it through, and each time you run it through, you can crank up the dial to the next number. Now once you hit, usually for me it's about 4 or 5, the dough starts to become really sticky, and that's okay. At that time, what I like to do is flour it on both sides and just give it a little swish through, and then cut it in half, because once you start getting into the higher numbers, that's also when your pasta starts to really stretch out. But you can see this dough isn't snapping back. It's going through nice and smooth. It's not sticking. It's not leaving flour everywhere. That is not perfection, but it's usually the closest I get to a really nice looking pasta dough. Once you get your pasta to the thickness that you'd like, it's time to cut. And depending on which width of noodle you choose, you just pop that onto the end of your stand mixer and turn it on. I like to drop I like to drop the noodles that I'm cutting directly into a bowl that has some flour in it. That way, as soon as they hit the bowl, I can just give them a little swish around and they get a pretty even dusting of flour. The intent isn't to really add any flour, it's just to make sure that any sticky spots get covered so that they don't stick together as they're sitting there waiting for the rest of the noodles to get rolled and cut. Down they go. And once they're in the bowl, like I said, I just give them a little swish around just so they get a little extra coating of flour. And then some people can swirl theirs into a cute nest. Every time I do that, mine stick together and I get mad at myself. So I just kind of set them aside. And then when it's time to boil them, you want to get your water to a good rolling boil. You add enough salt to make the water saline. I don't know what that means. It means as salty as the ocean, but I don't drink a lot of ocean water. So I just put about a tablespoon or like a heavy palm size drop of salt in there. And then once your water is back to a rolling boil, you can drop about 3 of these little nesty sized pastas in at a time. Swirl them around immediately so that they don't stick, and then once they're done cooking, they'll rise to the surface. It takes about 1 to 2 minutes, but always give 1 or 2 noodles just a quick taste to see if they're done. And then what I like to do, instead of draining them, because often I'm making a batch where I have to make multiple trips back to the pot, I'll just pull them out with some tongs or a little noodle grabber and pop them into the strainer, and then have a bowl ready, because the other thing about noodles that are this delicate is they need to have some butter or oil or something put on them right away and get tossed around so that they don't get settled and sticky and stick to one another. So once you've boiled your noodles, it's time to eat. I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial on made from Scratchee pasta. I'll see you next time.